Well, as many of you who listen to our podcast regularly know, I'm a huge game show fan. If there's a game show convention in town, I'm there all the days that the convention's happening and then some. And we just lost a game show legend. I'm talking about Charles Herbert Woolery. He was born in 1941 in Ashland, Kentucky, and he aspired to be a singer-songwriter. And he served 2 years in the United States Navy, and he also worked as a wine consultant. And by the late 60s, he was in a folk band called the Bordermen, and later on formed a duo called the Avant-Garde, kind of a psychedelic pop genre, where he had a hit. And it was a one-hit wonder band called, and this was the name of the song. It was an anti-drug song called Naturally Stoned. And I'm somebody I confess I'm a teetotaler, so I like to joke I'm kind of goofy and therefore I am naturally stoned. So that's where you get the title from, or the term from, I guess. And he had a couple of other albums, but nothing charted. And then he decided to turn to acting. He married actress Joanne Flug in 1972. That was his second wife. And they appeared on several game shows together, including Tattletales. And on Tattletales, he was billed as a singer-songwriter. And as far as acting was concerned, he was Mr. Dingle on the children's television show The New Zoo Revue back in the early 1970s. In fact, Doug and Emmy Joe, the hosts of that show, paid a very loving tribute to Chuck on their Facebook wall. Check it out if you haven't done so already. And then in 1974, the networks brought back the show Your Hit Parade, which was originally on the 1950s, where a group of musicians and singers would recreate the hits of the time. And so Chuck Woolery was one of the singers on the revival of that show, but it didn't last very long. And in the meantime, in 1973, Chuck had hosted a pilot called Shopper's Bazaar, which took place in a department store, and the three contestants each were vying for the chance to shop in a different department of that department store. And it had a vertical wheel and a puzzle board, an electronic puzzle board, but it didn't sell. And then about a year later, the show was retooled as Wheel of Fortune, and again, another pilot was done. And this time, Ed Cookie Burns was signed to host the show. And they did about 2 or 3 different shows. Now, what happened was the intent was to have an electronic puzzle board for the program. But the company that made them said it's going to be 4 to 6 weeks in order to ship out and manufacture this, or manufacture and ship the puzzle board. So Merv Griffin only had 2 weeks to do the pilot. So he thought, let me do this. Let's get a model to turn the letters, and then if the show if it gets sold, then we'll go back and get the puzzle board. So they did the pilot, and Ed Cookie Burns just wasn't the right choice for the show. If you listen to my interview with Wesley Hyatt, who just authored the great book, I'd Like to Buy a Vowel, Spinning 50 Years of Wheel of Fortune, you'll find out why Ed Cookie Burns was not retained. So Chuck Woolery became the host, and the idea of a model turning letters was so popular with the focus group that they kept that instead of having an electronic puzzle board just automatically place the letters, kind of like on the game show Crosswits. So Chuck Woolery became the host of the show, and at first, here's an interesting factoid about that program. One of the people that was offered the gig was Jim Lang, host of the Dating Game. And world-famous Tom Murphy, who we interviewed on this podcast, told me that one time he ran into Lang at a bar in Los Angeles, and they were just kind of talking shop, and Lang said, yeah, my agent said there's this really ridiculous game show. He said, yeah, turn it down. It's not going to be a hit. It's called Wheel of Fortune. And so Wheel of Fortune what it did was the ratings weren't humongous, but what it did do is that it cut into the ratings of Gambit starring Wink Martindale, which at that point was a 2.5-year-long hit. So Wheel of Fortune with Chuck Woolery, he hosted the program from January 1975 until December 25th, 1981. And that's where I first remember Wheel of Fortune was Chuck Woolery and hostess Susan Stafford. I remember Chuck had long hair, which was the quintessential game show host for NBC's head of daytime programming when Wheel debuted, Lynn Boleyn. She wanted game show hosts who had long hair, where were in their like late 20s to early 40s in age range, to have long sideburns, don bell bottoms, leisure suits, open collared shirts, just kind of have a really kind of relaxed vibe to them instead of just the suit and tie and dress shirt look. And Chuck Woolery succeeded. And he was different than other game show hosts. He was from Kentucky. And, I mean, granted, yeah, Jack Nars and his younger brother Tom Kennedy were also from Kentucky, but they were more of the old school. Chuck Woolery was the new generation of game show hosts. And Chuck was not perfect. He didn't have the smooth delivery with few mistakes. He oftentimes made mistakes, but that was part of his charm. And he'd oftentimes make fun of it. He didn't get upset. He didn't get flustered. He kind of like, well, there goes that one. Like, for instance, when he'd give the wheel a final spin, he always would lick his finger as for good luck. He's like, all right, let's see what this goes. One time on the show, I think he hit the bankrupt 4 times in a row during the final spin, and they didn't edit it out of the show. They kept it in the show because it was just so hilarious. The responses that Chuck made each time he hit bankrupt on that wheel. And then sometimes he'd make fun of the prizes, like when the contestant had less than $100 to spend. He says, you want to go for the candy dish? And so I'll take the candy dish for $80. I'm not sure where any candy dish costs $80, but those prizes on Wheel of Fortune were always overinflated, it looked like. Like for my youth pastor said, for $750, that toaster oven. And Chuck and Susan also had a great chemistry on the show, where after the show was done, at the end, they'd kind of talk and banter back and forth. And that's what also made the program as well. So Chuck Woolery really was the one who laid the groundwork for what's now called America's Game. Unfortunately, a salary dispute with creator and producer Merv Griffin is what ended his time there. But Merv did let Chuck do one final episode. And when he did the final episode, Susan Stafford gave him some glasses with windshield wipers on them to wipe away the tears. And so Chuck did continue on with singing and songwriting, but he got another gig about a year later called Love Connection. I think it was interesting how Chuck handled the different dating situations. I mean, some dates did go well. Other dates, the couples were very nice people, but they just weren't a match. And then other times there's a lot of animosity, a lot of arguing. Yet Chuck seemed to just be able to, he had like the perfect words to keep things at bay as much as possible. Although sometimes even he couldn't keep the arguing down. But I thought it was interesting because even after a horrible dating situation, the person sitting next to Chuck, well, they took the commercial break, the guy or the gal who had the terrible date is like smiling, laughing with Chuck as they break for a commercial. I think the most interesting one was there was a guy who was on for his second date. His first date didn't work out and the audience had selected somebody else. And so they had him going on the second date, which they paid for. And finally, Chuck had the courage to ask him, the guy was wearing a cowboy hat and Chuck said, "Why are you wearing a hat?" And the guy said, "Well, Chuck, see, I got a receding hairline." And his date said, "Chuck, have him take the hat off." And Chuck said, "Would you mind taking the hat off?" And sure enough, the guy did. And yeah, it was receding all right, receding all the way to the back. He had no hair on top whatsoever. But only Chuck Woolery could do something like that. I couldn't see any other host asking a contestant to take their hat off like that and them obliging. But yeah, he was great with that show. So much so that the very first episode of In Living Color, the first time I ever remember Jim Carrey, was a parody of Love Connection. And Carrey was spot on. He says, "Welcome back to Love Connection. We're back, like I said, in 2 and 2. And I wasn't even aware of that program probably till about a year and a half after it debuted. And I found out about it when he started hosting Scrabble come the summer of 1984. And I'd never played the game Scrabble myself in my life up until that point. So when I got the Scrabble board game in my house, I was trying to play it like you played the game show, not having a clue the way the game really worked. That's how addicted I was to TV Scrabble. And eventually they did have a TV Scrabble home game for people who loved the way it was on television. And, again, Chuck Woolery was his hair was shorter, but he was still the same guy that you knew on Wheel of Fortune. I remember one time on the show, a contestant had an E as one of the two letters to select during the main game. And so he said to Chuck, "I'll buy the E." And Chuck said, "On this show, it's free." And then Chuck quipped, "Wouldn't it be awesome if we had an electronic or a computerized Vanna White placing the letters on the board there?" Now, I thought it was kind of funny about that, but I was like, wait a minute, he didn't say Susan Stafford, but of course, Vanna by that point was the hostess of Wheel of Fortune for about 5 years, so most people knew Vanna at that point, plus Wheel was number one in syndication in prime time. And then another time was toward the end where Chuck would have the contestants read, "Would you like to be a contestant on Scrabble or to send in for a Scrabble t-shirt?" He'd oftentimes say, "All right, who did that puzzle right there? Who did that word?" And kind of poke fun at the staff behind the scenes. And he'd oftentimes break the fourth wall on Scrabble. And so he was able to do more things on Scrabble than he was on Wheel of Fortune. It was just great. In fact, the final episode of Scrabble in 1990 said, "Don't cancel us, just replace me as host." It worked for Wheel. And then he continued on doing Love Connection. And then in 1993, Scrabble did come back, again with Chuck Woolery as host and Charlie Tuna as announcer. And I got to intern with Oldies 93 CBS FM. And I talked to Charlie just before Scrabble debuted again. And Charlie was really excited about that. He says, yeah, they should have never canceled in the first place because every show they've had on since then has failed. Unfortunately, that revival of Scrabble did not last very long. It lasted about 6 months. It was teamed with Dick Clark's game show Scattergories, but the excitement just wasn't there. The set didn't look like the Scrabble crossword game. And then on the original Scrabble, where contestants would win money if the last letter they placed on the board before they solved it was in the pink or blue square, this one, if you landed the pink or blue square, it would just go into a jackpot, and whoever contestant won or solved 3 puzzles would win whatever money, and that just wasn't as exciting. But Chuck continued on with other shows. He co-hosted with Christina Ferrari another talk show, which was called Home and Family, and did that for about 2 years. From 1997 to 99, kind of playing off his Love Connection experience, he hosted The Dating Game. And then in 1999 was the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire craze. And that Millionaire, nobody expected that to be a success. ABC was in third place at the time. And so they decided instead of just running repeats of failed shows, let's look at this British game show that's taking the UK by storm and bring it here. And they got Regis Philbin, who hadn't hosted a game show in 24 years. And he hosted one of the worst game shows ever in 1975 called The Neighbors. But Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was a huge success. Regis says, "Is that your final answer?" And, it took the world by storm. So all these other networks wanted their own millionaire, kind of the show that would be the big money quiz show that they could have and call their own. So Dick Clark, along with Bob Bowden, created the show Greed. And they pitched it and sold it to the Fox network. And it debuted in November of 1999, and Chuck Woolery was the host of that show. It was not exactly the same format. In fact, it wasn't the same format as Millionaire, but it was kind of like Millionaire on steroids. And there are all these, twists and turns to it. And Chuck Woolery is like, "Do you have the need for greed?" was an oft-heard phrase on that program. And it really kept you drawn in because you're like, okay, is this contestant going to win $2 million or are they going to go away with absolutely nothing? Unfortunately, the show got canceled after just 44 episodes. It was gone by July of 2000. And despite good ratings, which I could never understand for the life of me, but Chuck Woolery continued on. He hosted Lingo on the Game Show Network from 2002 to 2007. And he also did other programs. He hosted The Price is Right live at Harrah's Entertainment Casinos, did the $250,000 game show Spectacular. He also hosted various podcasts as well and appeared on TV commercials throughout the years. One time there was a commercial for, I think it was 1-800-COLLECT, or one of those long-distance companies, where a guy was having trouble with his luck as far as calling up his girlfriend, and Chuck Woolery suddenly is in this guy's living room, and he's like, Chuck Woolery, You want to talk about it? Because Chuck would always, that was kind of a phrase on Love Connection. I especially loved it. It was like, I'm sorry the date didn't go well. He wants to pay for another one. And then another kind of phrase that Chuck created on Love Connection, and he did it on a couple of game shows. He didn't do it on Wheel of Fortune or Scrabble, but he did do it on the dating game, was, we'll be back in 2 and 2, and then point the finger right after you hit the 2 and 2, kind of like back and forth as far as twisting his hand, and then he'd point forward to the camera to go to commercial. But Chuck Woolery was a great MC, and I never got to meet him. I got to meet his co-host, Susan Stafford. And if you want to find out more about Chuck, read 2 great books. There's Wesley Hyatt's book, which I mentioned earlier, called I'd Like to Buy a Vowel, Spinning 50 Years of Wheel of Fortune. It's at bearmanormedia.com. That's BEARMANOR media, bearmanormedia.com. And also Susan Stafford's book titled Stop the Wheel, I Want to Get Off. What are your memories of Chuck Woolery? Comment below right here at YouTube and let us know.